Oh, welcome back to the Presilience Podcast. And we are putting together a bit of a special panel for this particular episode. Unfortunately, again, with some tragic news coming out of the United States with the latest tragedy in Uvalde in Texas. We, as a group, decided that it might be beneficial for us to be able to get together some thoughts and bring some lessons or some maybe draw upon what lessons could be learned out of the latest tragedy for the sake of our listeners and for our friends and family and communities here in Australia. Now, I'm joined on this particular panel once again by my esteemed colleagues. I have Leanne Close, former Deputy Commissioner of the Australian Federal Police, 30-year career in law enforcement and a subject matter expert in national security and criminal justice. We have Mr. Jason Alcorn, the General Manager of Security at Risk 2 Solution, former police officer, and air security officer, as well as aid sector security specialist in physical security, crime prevention through environmental design and training capability. And of course, Dr. Gav Schneider, CEO of Risk 2 Solution Group, who holds a doctorate in security management and a much awarded influential security thought leader. And I'll be chiming into the conversation as well, Joe Saunders, General Manager, Business Integration Development and Delivery at Risk 2 Solution and 2021 Outstanding Security Consultant of the Year. So now the introductions are out of the way, let's jump straight into the story of the day. Obviously, not a happy one, and nor something that we wish we were talking about. All of us on the panel either have young children around the same age as those that were impacted by this terrible tragedy, or have had children at that age. It's certainly, there's no parent on the planet that can watch the media coverage of what happened and not be profoundly impacted. So I'd like to say, as by way of introduction to the panel discussion we're going to have today, by no means is anything we say intended to be critical of anyone's role in anything that has gone on, other than the perpetrator, obviously. But it is not to heap blame upon schools or law enforcement response or training or culture or laws or anything else. We understand there's a long investigation that will take place that will bring those facts to light. Our goal is purely to take what we know so far and see what can be learned out of this that can help keep our kids, our teachers, and our colleagues safe moving forward. So by way of structure, we'd like to approach this through the Presilience lens of looking at compliance, then resilience, then presilience. So to speak to the law enforcement side to begin with, I'd like to throw to Leanne Close. Leanne, from a compliance angle, can you talk us through what is the law enforcement preparation for something like this?
Thanks, Joe. And again, it's such a tragic circumstance that we have to be talking about this, but unfortunately it's the reality of the world that we live in. From an Australian context, we have to go back about 20 odd years when, in fact, we were looking at what happened in Columbine in the school there back in 1999. That was a similar circumstance. There was two shooters, active shooters, went into Columbine High School and they killed, I think it was 12 students and at least one teacher in that incident over a number of minutes, it ends up being. And the response after that, from a law enforcement perspective, was really considered seriously in Australia, where you have active armed offenders on a premises in a school in that sort of environment. We kept looking at the issue and we thought we had a different context in Australia. We don't have as many guns and weapons in the community as they did in the United States. We certainly looked at our intelligence processes. Then came Mumbai, the terrorist incidents. There was a dozen incidents over a 3 or 4 day period in Mumbai back in 2008. That's when we really looked significantly at our training. Prior to that, a law enforcement context was heavily reliant on intelligence. But when a shooting incident occurred, it was all about cordon, contain, negotiate, talk the people out of the situation if you could. And there were plans, of course, to escalate depending on what happens within that incident. But the response was to wait, to see what's happening, gather all the intelligence. After Mumbai, we changed the training in Australia and around the world. In Australia, we looked at best practices in the globe. And so we went to a much more active response, a rapid action deployment. We trained people in groups of from 2 upwards into teams to go into a school or a premises where there was an active shooter and to actually move through that premises in a targeted way to understand what was going on and to try to prevent and stop the incident.
So, Leanne, just thinking about this from a law enforcement response point of view, because living in the relatively safe country that we do, with a very well-trained professional police presence, that for most of us in metropolitan areas feel like the police are pretty close by. What are some of the snags that will impact a police response to a critical incident? It doesn't have to be an active shooter. It could be a person who is acting strangely, a person who might be brandishing a knife, things along those lines. In terms of maybe the communication, the information that's provided, what are some of the limitations that may slow down a response?
Well, if we look at the incident in Sydney in the Lindt Cafe siege as another example, very much an Australian response. The police are getting phone calls from multiple sources over a quick period of time. Information is trying to flow out from people inside where the incident's taking place. Police are trying to understand what's happened. For example, in the Lindt Cafe siege, the offender there alleged that he had bombs placed around the rest of Sydney and had allegedly a bomb strapped to himself as well. So that really makes the police have to set up their command post, really be thinking through the scenario, what's going on, what resources do I need to have? They do a cordon contain to make sure that people are as far away from the incident scene as possible, so no more people could be potentially injured or killed should things go wrong. And there is a huge amount of communication happening with emergency services, with other police responses, with negotiators coming in to try to negotiate with the offender or offenders in that instance. So there are multiple things happening all at once, being managed by a command post close to the incident, and then one further back where multiple resources, multiple support from a whole range of different organisations, emergency service responders, etc., intelligence agencies can come together to work out what's the best strategy to deal with this incident.
Yeah, thanks, Leanne. Jason, I might just go to you to talk about it from a physical security, or I guess probably an enterprise security point of view, more so than physical security. I did mention during Jason's very brief intro, he has worked as a national head of security for a number of different large organizations, and certainly had events such as this on his radar of things that he had to be prepared for. So I'd like to ask you, Jace, just from a compliance point of view, a basics point of view, what are some of the things that you would look at in terms of building a system within an organization to be able to manage a catastrophe along these lines?
Yes, thanks, Joe. I think straight out of the gate, one of the large pieces which needs to be addressed is the awareness, leading at the front end, awareness amongst school faculties, educators, even the student body. At the moment, it's very much identified as an American problem based on their context, their availability of firearms, which are unique characteristics to that country. However, if you look at what's identified as some of the root causes of the school-based shootings, being bullying, family dysfunction, mental health issues, we are anecdotally hearing reports that they are represented within Australian schools themselves. The only thing not consistent on a par is that access to firearms. So that awareness piece is a large piece. Who would students or parents of children approach? Who would they escalate any behaviours or information or conversations of concern that could indicate an attack of some nature was potentially being planned at an education facility in Australia? Of course, all education facilities, commercial entities are required to undertake a full and comprehensive security risk assessment, identify the risks specific to that industry, that school, that faculty. But carrying on from that comprehensive security risk assessments, most Australian work health and safety acts, the model work health and safety acts, require, as well as the assessment, implementing reasonably practical controls to manage those identifiable risks to health and safety, employees, students, and also visitors to the grounds as well. Putting that into practice, and all hazards approach, looking at the nature of the threats, reviewing specific to active armed offenders or attacks on school students, the faculty, reviewing all the internal, external entry points, determine how classrooms can be locked down, what's the best way to secure classrooms, if that's the best solution in that specific campus, residence, education facility. Can doors be locked? Is it possible to lock doors? Should students be evacuated out? Rehearsing emergency drills. Traditionally, and this has been represented in the States in, for example, the Sandy Hook shooting quite some years ago, another tragic event where it's alleged that the offender was aware of emergency security procedures. A fire alarm drill was initiated in the anticipation or expectation that people would evacuate through a certain exit and then present themselves as targets to the offender. So what is applicable in a fire emergency, a normal emergency evacuation, may not be the best course of action in an active armed offender or a violent assault on students, visitors or staff at the faculty. So those emergency exit drills, those normal emergency procedures still need to be rehearsed, but also need to be rehearsed with the lens of an armed offender, armed in some manner, with the intent to attack the students, faculty, visitors to the school. Another big piece, as mentioned earlier, internally, those processes and mechanisms for identifying, reporting and escalating incidents of bullying, harassment within the faculty, within the school, as a motivating factor to identify students that could be at risk of taking these extreme acts in retaliation or revenge. Having those open conversations with the students and the parents and the faculty, the teachers and staff, how to identify those behaviours, what those behaviours look like, how to escalate, and a function where those reports, those incidents of behaviours of concern can be identified, tracked and actioned in the best interest of the individuals affected, and ultimately to avoid these tragic events from occurring. Another aspect, again, we're seeing increasingly over recent months as Australia, as the rest of the world opens up, there's been a lot of access or a lot of potential to radicalise online. If you look at the previous lone wolf attacker, the essential elements were social isolation, access to the internet, radical ideologies, extremist methodologies, and motivation. So looking at the events that have happened in the US over the years, again, accepting that mass shootings in school education facilities in Australia, I believe there's been 6 since the early 1990s. So it's not to the same magnitude, but we still have all the same basic moving parts, pieces, contributing factors to make up that jigsaw puzzle.
Thanks for that, Jace. I just want to pick up on a thread you had there. Maybe I'll throw this one to Gav. Jace, Jason mentioned the communication of early warning signs, and I know certainly from my role working workplace violence and the amount of time I've spent sort of digging into active shooter events, while there's no set profile of what makes up an active shooter or a spree killer, depending on which literature you're reading, they do have some things in common. Nearly always there is an element of social exclusion or isolation that has led up to this. There's nearly always a suicidal intent as opposed to a homicidal intent that becomes evident first. And in just about every case, there has been significant leakage of intent prior to the actual attack. There's some where the killer has told somebody that they're planning to do this, looking for some kind of response. And unfortunately, in most cases, that doesn't get reported or doesn't get reported effectively. So, Gav, I might just throw over to you from a general compliance point of view. What can we do to capture that information? And thinking about this in the education context, every single teacher out there in every single class they teach has one kid who's lonely or isolated. They're going to have a couple of kids that come from dodgy family backgrounds. They're going to have some kids that have some predisposition towards antisocial behavior. And yet we know that 1 in a million of those might ever act out violently and take someone's life. So it's not that it's on the teachers to identify these kids, because they can already identify them when we first bring up the topic. It's about how do we collect that information when there is that significant leakage, and how do we build systems so that whether it's the teachers, whether it's the administrators, whether it's the groundskeepers, or whether it's the other kids, someone can pass on that information and hopefully prevent something like this from happening.
Thanks, Joe. Building on what my colleagues had to say, I think there's a few considerations. The first one is it has to start with a level of acceptance that sometimes bad things could happen and people who we never thought could perpetrate those bad things might do it. Without that level of acceptance, there's never action. And to your point, what's the point of reporting if nobody's going to listen or do anything about it? So I like to think one of the critical points with this stuff is to think of everything like an ecosystem. And you want to have, Jace mentioned all hazards. You want to have a true all hazards approach to the things that could go wrong. It's interesting. We want to shelter our children, but we still expose them to first aid training, which means they're exposed to the concept that people could pass away. We still expose them to fire drills, which involve buildings burning down. We've just been very lucky in Australia that we haven't, probably since Port Arthur, had a significant multi-casualty active shooter incident like this. But what is important to note is that the early indications of mental health issues, social isolation, radicalization, as Jason and Leanne both mentioned, should be things we should be actioning anyway. The challenge we've got, and you raised it very well, is it's not just the teacher. This is an ecosystem. Okay? And if we don't take an ecosystem approach to it, we're constantly going to be caught off guard. So I think from a compliance perspective, it requires the boards of schools, it requires the executives to be thinking about these things, accept that they could happen, and also translate these things across domains. A lot of the indicators you mentioned might not be happening physically, but they'll be happening on virtual domains. Okay, we've got a metaverse happening around us. We've got people interacting online in ways they've never had before. But we've got this intersection of virtual life and physical life, and we often see these things intersect. So, I think one of the key things is, the old saying, see something, say something. It should be see something, say something, do something as early as conceivably possible. And then maybe just one more point on the compliance side of things before we move to resilience. We've got really good guidance in Australia out of the ANZ CTC crowded places strategy. And I would urge, it doesn't really matter if you're a school or a workplace, pick up that guidance and try and understand it. Because understanding that, whether it's escape, hide, tell, whether it's simple formulas, like, the more time and the more freedom an attacker has, the more casualties we tend to have. And therefore, simple little things like planning ahead. When we talk about compliance, Jace mentioned locking doors. And, when I was looking at this stuff with my PhD nearly 15 years ago, some of the most effective machinations to prevent casualties during active armed offender attacks were simply door jams and being able to lock doors, being able to stop the freedom of movement. So I think one of the narratives we have to move away from is this will never happen here. We're totally safe here. Bad stuff doesn't happen in Australia. It's if something bad happens, how do we make sure it doesn't beforehand? And if it does, how do we minimize the likelihood of negative impacts? And it's a significant change from the old modeling. When I say the old modeling, the idea that I don't have to do anything as a school, as a teacher, as a principal, as a board, because the police will handle it. And I think one thing is true from this case we've looked at, and this is true for any law enforcement jurisdiction in the world. They don't have endless resources. They don't have millions of people everywhere. And attackers are also not stupid. They will perform their attacks when they have the most likely chance of success. So we've got to be thinking about a real ecosystem here where everybody contributes ahead of time. And I know we're talking under the banner of compliance. This should be part and parcel of every emergency management plan done at every school, university, college, hospital, etc. Any place of mass gathering that hasn't considered the way they would deal with something like this is potentially setting themselves up for negligence later down the line. It's a foreseeable risk. We have the ANZ CTC guidance. We have workplace health and safety legislation that talks about foreseeable risk being managed in a reasonably practicable way. And we have subject matter experts in the country who can help. And sometimes, even if you don't have the budget, you pick up the ANZ CTC guidance, you talk to your local police officer, and you're still slightly better off. So I think it's a shift in mindset to make this part of the way we deal with business as usual, not hoping it will never happen to us.
Yeah, agreed, Gavin. Just to echo what you said there, I mean, we can say that, well, we don't have the gun culture issue, we don't have the availability of firearms, but we do know that there are an increase in assaults happening in schools. We do know that there's an increase in teachers being assaulted in schools. We do know there's an increase in kids bringing knives and sharp objects to schools with the intent of causing fear, if not harm. We know these things are happening in our schools in Australia. So whether thankfully, if it does happen, the catastrophic consequences will maybe not manifest, or at least not to the same level. But we can't turn a blind eye to it and pretend that all the risk factors that lead up to the acquisition of a firearm are not still present in our schools, and that we have to do something about it. So, Leanne, just to do one final round, talking about resilience and presilience, perhaps from a law enforcement point of view, what are some of the things that we can be doing as a society, as business owners, as educators, that can help facilitate better relationships with law enforcement and a better response and capability and intelligence for law enforcement?
So, Joe, we've touched on it already. The starting point really is having that conversation within your executive, whether it's in a school, within a business. Have that discussion about what are the possible risks that are going to occur for our premises. Who are the people who we've got here? What are our plans? What's our training? And do some exercise and drills. Now, in terms of that connection to law enforcement, absolutely, they should be, all schools especially, already have a good relationship with their local area commands on the ground, the local police station, and the police officers have an outreach program and they know how vulnerable schools can be. And you're right, we're not blind to the fact that these sorts of incidents, some sort of hazard can occur. So the schools are doing drills and they are thinking that through, but talk it through after these sorts of incidents occur. Make sure your plans are up to date and think about doing another exercise within your environment.
Excellent. Thank you, Leanne. Jason, from your perspective, we talked about compliance from a security management point of view. What are some of the things we should be looking at to be a little bit presilient or proactive about how we go about addressing these issues?
Look, on top of the regular emergency procedures, rehearsals, evacuations, I think a big part of this in regards to both the regulatory and the preparedness is that assessment, the acceptance that we're not immune to acts of terror, acts of violence, public places, school and education facilities included. Having those conversations and having those conduits open for the information, the intelligence to be available to allow the security managers, security teams, the mental health, human resources, people and culture and faculty be able to identify and assist individuals at harm, both to prepare for an event that could happen, but ideally, best place practice is to prevent that incident occurring in the first place. So we don't have to minimise the harm being done, but prevent the harm in its entirety.
Nicely said. Gav, maybe final word over to you. You're an expert in risk culture and how we go about, I guess, changing the conversation around topics that people don't want to talk about. And this certainly fits, even when we're putting this panel together, none of us really wanted to talk about this topic, but it was something we felt we had to do with the expertise in the room. But how does a school or educational institution or even just a general business, how do they go about becoming more proactive and presilient to address a risk that, one, a lot of people probably don't think is a real risk for them, and two, is not palatable to begin with, even if they do acknowledge that it's a possibility?
Thanks, Joe. So I think a few things, and it's probably worth just starting off with the idea of resilience, and that sometimes bad things happen to good people. And the more prepared we are for that ahead of time, the more likely we are to minimize the negative consequences. Thus, we run fire drills, evacuation drills, lockdown drills, etc. So while we don't want to normalize that bad things happen, what we don't want to be doing is pretending that no bad things ever happen and creating this atmosphere of what we often refer to as risk theater. We pretend we're doing stuff, but it's not enough to really make a difference. I think it's important also to note that depending on the age of your kids, many kids watch the news, they have lots of exposure to different pieces of information. Pretending nothing is wrong doesn't necessarily prepare them. Or simply going, hey, nothing bad will happen to you, this is Australia, doesn't necessarily prepare them. A balanced, well-rounded conversation from parents to child, just the same way you teach someone to safely cross the road, okay, is important. We have the guidance under the ANZCT side of things around escape, hide, tell. The US has run, hide, fight. Realistically, under stress, people will freeze, they will flight, they will fight, or they will panic. And if we look at the response to really serious things, we don't want them to freeze, we don't want them to panic. We want them to be able to run in a coordinated way, hide in a coordinated way, and if they have no choice, be able to protect themselves. So I think it's not a discussion of what do we do? We know what to do. The guidance is out there. It's an acceptance of how do we prepare for it. To your point around prevention and that proactive presilience piece, it does take a level of maturity from school boards, okay, or regulators to actually accept the fact that the indicators that are causing mental health and mental distress and suicide in schools are exactly the same indicators that could drive children to assault teachers, assault each other, And potentially we're only sitting here waiting for fatalities there. It's not whether we will. We probably are already. They might just be reported as different things. So to your point, COVID has been tremendously stressful for many, many, many people, children included. We've lost our social coping mechanisms. We're relearning them. It's really important during these times for leadership to take that role and to start driving the right narrative. And when I say that, there is no perfect narrative, but there is something within, you talk about risk culture, within your school's risk appetite and tolerance levels that shouldn't be sitting in the, it'll never happen here, we shouldn't do anything about it, but nor should it be sitting, we should put a ton of resources into active shooter incidents because, that's not the primary aim of a school. But there is a balance there. And if we're going to run fire drills, if we're going to do lockdowns, if we're going to teach mental health and mental resilience, if we should be teaching vigilance and awareness, then why not include that in all sorts of risks that will make our kids, our teachers, our parents safer and enable us to work better with the authorities. So, to close off from my side, it's absolutely brutal and horrifying when these things happen. But there's been a lot of research over the last 20 years showing that there are triggers and causes for these things that are societal, not just access to weapons. That certainly, ensures a far worse outcome. But realistically, exposure to violent video games, exposure to violent TV, kids being isolated, and teachers not knowing how to cope, parents not knowing how to cope, all don't have good outcomes. So this is potentially a very good opportunity for us as a society to be resilient, not to wait for the first attack to do something about it, but to try and action some of these things ahead of time. And hopefully, if we can do enough of that, we'll never land up with a mass casualty event like this in an Australian school. Thanks, Joe.
Yeah, thanks, Gav. And I'll just go around to give everyone a 1 minute closing thoughts as well. But I just want to echo something that Gav said there. There's so much we can do for our kids without it being under the guise of a big, awful, horrible, life-changing incident. Things like being able to run situational awareness, just be able to identify suspicious behaviors, being able to identify when something doesn't feel right, knowing how to talk to police or how to report a crime. These are things that we don't really teach our kids how to do. And if a child has the ability to recognize that someone doesn't look right, something seems out of place, I know who to tell and I know how to tell them. You don't know that could be very, very valuable life skills for that child, let alone be able to hopefully circumvent a really serious incident as well. So any closing thoughts from you, Leanne?
Just really echoing what you both just said there, Joe, in terms of tell people if you see that there's some suspicious behaviour, if you've got concerns about people. I know that people don't like to often report this, particularly to law enforcement. However, there's Crime Stoppers, which can be reported anonymously, any issues that might be raised. Police, especially law enforcement, your local police station, they want to know what's going on and they're happy to get that sort of intelligence information. Family and friends are the ones who know where people are suffering, where people might be considering committing these sorts of terrible crimes. Reach out and report it. Tell people, if you're a child, tell someone, a teacher or someone that you trust, so that information can be gathered and hopefully we can prevent some of these incidents from occurring into the future.
Well said. And over to you, Jason, for any closing thoughts.
Yes, look, to reinforce what everyone has said in closing, the reality is no one wants to have these conversations. It's very easy to say this is an American problem, it's not an Australian problem. However, at the end of the day, when you look at the potential very high stakes and consequences, it's much more worthwhile to have the conversations, have these uncomfortable conversations, talk to your children, your faculty, have these rehearsals, have these drills. There will always be detractors that say this isn't relevant, it doesn't happen here. The reality is it doesn't happen here as much. It has happened here. It continues to happen here. It happens in a very different way. But at the end of the day, when you look at responsibility, duty of care, and even your own obligation to do what you know is best, the outcome of not having these conversations and not running these drills and then an incident happens are almost unforgivable.
Agreed. And over to you, Gav, for final closing thoughts.
Thanks, Joe. I think every time something like this happens, there's the tendency to go into perceptual defense and not want to think about it. or potentially just come up with a narrative that makes it feel easier for us, like this is not an Australian problem, it won't happen here. Okay? But just think about a few things, right? Let's look at the UK. Also not a gun culture, but take time and Google knife crime UK, see what comes up. Right? The challenge we've got now is, I moved my family here 15 years ago because Australia is comparatively a very safe place to live. But comparatively safe doesn't mean it's perfectly safe and bad stuff never happens. And, one of the challenges we've got is to make sure that we can prevent these bad things from happening. That's the model of presilience, right? It's not just the resilience or the toughness to persevere when something bad happens. How do we stop these bad things from happening? So in summary, I think the core piece we've got to look at is we've got to use these sort of incidents as learning for us too. And I think we should be very, very careful that we don't fall into the trap of going, just because we're a gun culture, nothing bad like this will ever happen. If our most senior law enforcement officials took the time to put together guidance on crowded places threats and how to respond to that, we should be taking that time to make sure we can implement those. And lastly, this is a human problem, right? And one of the challenges we have is where we wish we were as a species compared to where we are. And I think every single one of us wishes we were in a place where bad things like this didn't happen and we could rationally discuss, any problem we faced. But we're not there. And the more stressed people get, the more cornered people get, the more frustrated they get. And Joe, you say this often, violence is a language. And when people aren't heard in other ways, they manifest in violence. An active shooter or mass casualty event is a significant scream after there's been lots and lots and lots of early warning indicators. This stuff doesn't happen randomly. We should be teaching all of us to look for these signs. And if we can intercept early, not only will we stop these things happening, we'll have a mentally healthier, more resilient, and hopefully a presilient culture, which can only be good for all of us. Thanks, Joe.
Well said, Gav. So in closing, look, for all of us on this panel, we're all mums and dads, we're all security experts, we're all educators in some form or another, and we've all spent significant time in the US and have loved ones there. It feels tokenistic to offer thoughts and prayers for those that are affected. I think probably what we really owe those affected is that we learn and that we actually stop these things from happening to the best of our abilities. And unfortunately, we can't do that without these tough conversations. So thank you very much to my panelists, and thank you very much for listening. We'll be back again next time with more of the Presilience Podcast.